Hi guys. So I don't know if you've also heard the news today that John MacArthur's church reopened, and a lot of people, especially on Twitter, are really happy about this and are saying that the rest of Christians need to join them in protesting against Newsom, our governor in California. So I think that there's a little more that can be said in this conversation. And I think that it's important for us to weigh our options in light of God's word and to, make up our own mind, no matter what our religious leaders believe on this. We always want to put God's word even above what they say. Just like the Bereans, right? They didn't just take Paul's word for it. They actually went and studied the scriptures to make sure that it was in line with their ultimate authority, which is God. And so this is kind of my response to the message that is kind of being put out there regarding this, which is that Jesus Christ is the head of the church and not Caesar. And absolutely agree with that. But I think that that message is kind of saying, hey, it's okay for the church to go against what the law of the land is, in light of like that the governor is overreaching his rights and he's stepping into our Christianity and telling us that we can't do certain things in our church gatherings. And so, like, gathering in person is being seen also as disobeying God. So, I'm just going to share something real quick that you can find in the book of Luke. There are 3 different situations where Jesus talked about himself, his deity, but it had to do with the Sabbath. And the Pharisees, the religious experts, the leaders of that time, what they were saying was not necessarily the God's command is that we need to gather, we need to sing in our churches. That's kind of what we're hearing in our times, right? But in those times, what they were saying is nobody should be doing anything on the Sabbath. And that is what Jesus is talking about and addressing. And it had ulterior motives because they wanted to accuse Jesus of doing something so that they could kill him, pretty much. So they wanted to use this against him. And there was a couple of situations where Jesus healed people on the Sabbath. And there was another situation where his disciples were like eating, and the Pharisees felt like, hey, they're preparing a meal, they're doing work on the Sabbath. Why do you allow them to do that? And so Jesus teaches us to look at the Sabbath a little more deeply. And I think he teaches us something that can apply in our situation today concerning churches reopening. And I feel like it's something that we don't have to come across so harsh to Christians and pastors and churches in California that are not choosing to reopen just yet, like MacArthur has decided. And so what Jesus says in these 3 situations is that it is good, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. It is good to preserve life, and it is good to do the greater good, even if that means that you are not doing the lesser good. So for example, Jesus references King David getting the bread that was designated for the priest, and he ate of it and he gave it to his companions. There's some typology in that situation where King David, he represents Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And so King David is like this anointed priest-like figure. So it was right for him to give this bread to his companions. He had these rights. And in the same way, Jesus says that he's the Lord of the Sabbath. So it is right and it is okay for him to allow his companions, his disciples, to get this food, even though it's technically breaking the command of the Sabbath. So obeying a law in the situation of David, where you're not allowed to get that bread. Normal people are not supposed to be eating it. But what would have been the greater good for David's companions, to not have eaten and to have obeyed that law? Or was the greater good and obeying God to have given that bread to his companions? And the Bible does not condemn David for having done so. And we can see it as what? He broke that command. But Jesus didn't condemn David also. In fact, he uses it to explain why it's lawful and it's okay for his disciples to technically break that law on Sabbath, because preservation of life is an even greater good. And he is more specific about this when he talks about it further down in Luke, a few chapters later, and he gives the example which person would not help if their son would have fallen in a well, or their ox. Like, even if it's a Sabbath, is it more good to obey the Sabbath and not work and don't do anything and just let them, just be there? Or is it a greater good to go help them, even though you're technically breaking the Sabbath command, but you're doing a greater good by helping that life that needs your help? And in the same way, Jesus was, healing people. He was doing good on the Sabbath, even though the Pharisees wanted to accuse him of breaking God's command. And so in the same way, I feel that the coronavirus pandemic, the way many churches have responded has been in light of this, a desire to preserve life. And I think that their Bible allows us to make a case for the churches and the Christians that are deciding not to gather or open up their churches just yet in pursuit of preserving life. I think that if that is the goal, then we are doing a greater good, even though we might not be obeying the command temporarily of opening up the churches physically and gathering. You can always make the case that, yeah, we might be breaking this command temporarily, but it is in the effort of obeying God in a greater command, which is supported by Jesus himself, which is to preserve life. And I think that we see that life isn't so black and white sometimes, even in God's word, because we have examples, for example, of Rahab lying, saying that the two spies were not in her house. And even Jesus, there's a place where he was keeping his brothers in the dark about him going to to the same place that they were going. But whenever there is a reason to preserve life, you can't see things so black and white. And I think God allows us to choose the greater good, even if that means that it looks like you are breaking another command. Jesus himself, when he was a baby and the political leaders were persecuting him, Jesus and his family fled that persecution to preserve life. When the enemy came to tempt Jesus and told him to throw himself, Jesus opted to preserve life. And he didn't do that. When he was faced by his corrupt, evil political leaders, Jesus submitted to the authorities even unto death. And he sets a good example for us, I think. The disciples, when they decided that they were going to obey God rather than men, it was because they were told not to preach, right? And I don't feel that I can relate to their situation, because we have the ability to preach about Jesus still. And I don't think that we should be using Bible verses out of context in order to suit our political sensibilities. I think that it's important to keep our Christianity on one side and our politics on the other side, and not try to use like our Christianity in order to support our political ambitions. In America, we have a very unique situation where we are in a democracy, very unlike the days of the disciples. And so a lot of the things I hear Christians saying are not like, we're not talking about the Bible, we're talking about the Constitution. And so as Americans, you have the right to protest. Clearly, in California, you have the right to protest. And so even though you're a Christian and you feel like your rights, which is an American issue, not a Christian issue, you feel like your rights are being taken from you, your religious liberties, you have the right to protest as an American. But it's very different to say that as a Christian, I am protesting as a Christian. I think it's important for us to say we're protesting as Americans, and our church is going to protest as an American church, and we're not going to like look down at other churches that are not going to protest as American churches. We don't want to put ourselves in the storylines of the Bible. We don't want to make ourselves seem as though we are those disciples that are being faced with that terrible Caesar and we need to come against him. We don't want to portray ourselves as Daniel, that we have this persecution and that they're telling us not to pray. We're not Daniel, just like people say you are not David, you're not the disciples, you are not Daniel. You are living in America, you have the right to protest as an American. And if that's what you want to do, and if that's what people in your church want to do, then that's your decision, and that's your right in America, clearly. Not sure what the consequences will be, but if that's something that you feel very strongly about, then you're in a country to do so. But I think it would be a good testimony for the world for us to differentiate our Christianity with our political ideologies. And if we're going to protest as a church, then let's put it out there that we're Americans and we have the freedom of religion, instead of trying to put arguments out there about the Bible that don't fit our unique situation at this time. And if you disagree with me, I welcome your disagreement. You don't have to think exactly like me to, follow my channel on YouTube. I'm all for it. Please feel free to disagree with me. So this is all I had to say, and thank you for listening. If you listened to the whole video, please give me a like. Thanks.